We are off. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Writing in Your Life Day by Day, hosted by 1455 as part of the 2022 Virginia Festival of the Book, a program of Virginia Humanities. I'm Sean Murphy. I am the founding director of 1455. We are a nonprofit arts organization, and our mission is very simple. We celebrate storytelling, and we have a variety of free programming that is dedicated to that mission. You can find out a lot more about us. Check out our archive of free material going back 5 years at 1455litarts.org. We thank you for joining us tonight. This event is sponsored by Anthology of Charlottesville. And this event is one in a series of 6 devoted to Virginia writing and publishing, presented by writing centers and organizations across Virginia, including us proudly at 1455, as well as James River Writers, the Muse Writers Center, Randolph College MFA, Watershed Lit at George Mason University, and Writers House. The full series of Virginia writing and publishing events are available at vabook.org, where you can also explore the full festival schedule and watch past events. While you're there, please consider making a donation to support the festival's ongoing work at vabook.org/give. This event, by the way, has optional closed captioning, which you can turn on and customize anytime during this program by using the closed captions tab at the bottom of your window. Now, I am very pleased to introduce our speakers. I will start with Ron Hogan. He is the author of Our Endless and Proper Work, and Ron has served in various capacities in and around the book publishing industry over the years. What's important here is that he is the founder of the literary site Beatrice and creator of the popular newsletter about developing your writing practice entitled Destroy Your Safe and Happy Lives. We are also joined by Lisa Tenner. She is the author of The Joy of Writing Journal, Spark Your Creativity in 8 minutes a day. She is an authority on nonfiction book writing, publishing, and creativity. She's the winner of the Silver Stevie Award for Coach Mentor of the Year, and she guides aspiring authors to joyfully write and publish. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Ron, Lisa, let's get started. To set the table a bit, I think it's relevant to position this discussion and both of your books in the context of the current literary landscape, which really mirrors our current kind of day-to-day reality, which is, I think most of us now are either encouraged or told to think of ourselves as brands and brand ourselves accordingly, so that we're always obsessed with refreshing that brand and curating that brand, which means we have to become masters of PR and marketing and sales and all that stuff. And there's a lot of truth to that. I think it's an inevitable part of the business landscape of writing. But both of your books kind of bring us back to step one, which is such a reset, and I found very refreshing, which is writers write. And writing is what matters most. It is the fundamental step. And I think in 2022, we kind of lose sight of that because we jumpstart to the business stuff. But both of your books underscore the fact that writers must write. And I think for whether it's an aspiring writer starting out or a veteran writer that finds themselves blocked or stymied in some way, I think these books are very good catalysts for how to do that in a very purposeful and productive way. So you both, clearly from my introductions, you've got a lot of experience in the literary and creative fields. I would love you each to talk a little bit about, it's clear that it comes out of the work you already do and are very involved in, but just talk a little bit about what prompted you and what was the thought behind these particular books. We can start with Lisa and then go to Ron.
Sure. Well, the truth is that one day I was talking to a friend, Tamara Manasov, who introduced me to the idea of putting QR codes in a book. And we were just chatting about it. And she also said something we were talking about some of my client books, because she's published a few of my client books that have QR codes in them, which link to videos or audios and kind of make it a more of a multimedia experience reading the book. And I asked her, Tamara, would you, because I was working on another book at the time, and I said, would you ever go back to a traditional publisher, or would you only self-publish at this point? She said, oh, I'd only self-publish. I love having control over my book. And we had this conversation, and the next morning I woke up with this idea for the Joy of Writing journal. So I feel kind of like I can't take credit for this great grand plan or anything like that. It just sort of came, and in one fell swoop in a few hours, and I wrote sort of just the initial ideas for the prompts, and some of those changed over time. But it was one of these things that just sort of happened. And then I worked with it a little and got some feedback from other writers, and they had much better ideas than I had of what I should do, tell a few stories. And so, it was really a group effort. But I think, if I'm going to take credit for some grand plan, like maybe my subconscious had a great idea, I think it is that so many of us do struggle to make the time for just that more spontaneous writing and really authentic, whatever really wants to come out. And that's really, for me, where the joy comes, and that feeling, that sometimes you reach that sort of ecstatic feeling when you're just in that flow, and just feel connected to everything, and it feels easy and beautiful. And so I think that is, somewhere deep within me, there was this desire to make that more accessible to people, and remind us, including remind myself, that's where it all comes from. And if we get too focused on Instagram and Twitter and whatever social media or other PR, we sort of lose sight of why we're doing this. Those things have a role in it, and certainly it's good to be reaching readers, but it's all got to come from that deeper place. And the Joy of Writing journal, it's a playful book, and I think it's meant to make it easy to commit to your writing practice and just see what comes up.
Yeah. Awesome. Ron, how about yourself?
Yeah, so I started the Destroy Your Safe and Happy Lives newsletter in 2018. And at the time, I felt like there were plenty of newsletters that were about like how to become a better writer, or like, building your brand or things like that. But when I started out with that newsletter, I really wanted to talk about the things about being in publishing that don't necessarily always get talked about. Yeah. So like some of the earliest installations or installments of that newsletter, I should say, were things like, what your cover designer at the what the art director at the publishers really does. And what do you do if you don't like the cover that you get? Or how does somebody terrible manage to get like a 6-figure book deal? And and so guiding people through the whole process of like a literary auction and things like that. But as I went on with the newsletter, I found myself gravitating more towards those sort of like deeper, fundamental, psychological, philosophical questions about like, well, why are you bothering doing this? Because I had already talked about it. It's like, let's talk about the economic reality that, less than 10% of people, of the books that get published are going to sell more than 5,000 copies. Right. Very few people are able to make an actual living, doing nothing but writing books in this day and age. So why are we bothering doing this? And it sort of evolved into that story of, it's like, well, you tell a story because you have to tell that story. You have something that you really feel compelled to share with the world, and you make yourself a better and better writer until you can share that story really effectively. And so, once the newsletter got into that groove, after a couple of years, I knew somebody, I knew Anne Trubeck at Belt Publishing. She was doing a really great newsletter about the business side of publishing. And when she announced that Belt was turning her newsletter into a book called So You Want to Publish a Book, I emailed her and said, that is a fabulous idea. How would you like a companion volume about the writing side of things? And she was like, that's a fabulous idea. And there we are.
Well, and I think as I say, I think these books complement each other really nicely in the sense that there's so much overlap. But if I were to very broadly generalize, Ron, you are on a mission of what I would very genuinely, flatteringly say is, the Zen of writing, like really getting into how does one find joy through the process. And Lisa, you really get in the trenches. I mean, it's literally a guidebook with prompts and exercises. But in both books, what we keep circling back to, and it seems a little bit reductive. And I look at my notes, and I mean, I wrote the same things over and over again. But I think that's kind of the point: is that process, by definition, is a process, and process involves that repetition and involves that purposeful sense of what one's doing, but balanced in a creative field where you don't always know what's about to happen. And I think that there's a weird sub-zen within that kind of improvisation balanced with discipline. So you both have kind of different approaches in the way you're circling this notion of writing for joy. But it does come back to this fundamental making the process a part of one's life and accepting that.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Zen, because one of my favorite writing books of all time is Gail Scher's One Continuous Mistake, which is exactly about that sort of thing. Is that writers write, you just get into the process, and as long as you're writing, you're a writer. And if you make, and you are going to make mistakes. Yeah. And what happens when you make a mistake is you keep going, and you refine, you refine your writing, you refine your ability, and you get a better understanding, a better understanding of what it is that you're trying to do. And ultimately, I think a better understanding of yourself and what matters to you.
Sure. What do you have to say to that, Lisa, as far as this notion of, the yin yang of process and discipline, but also finding room for joy and surprising oneself?
Yeah. It's an interesting question. I think for a long time I struggled with consistency. Excuse me. But I struggled with consistency, and I'd have these periods where I'd be writing a lot, and then periods that were really fallow. I think some of that was fear, and I think for me, journaling is such a great place to write because you're not worrying about who you're writing for, and you're not having to perform. I think my husband recently pointed out that I'm very performance oriented, even when I'm like fixing dinner, and so everything's stressful, and that's not very helpful when you're writing. And so the journal is a place where you really can explore and give yourself freedom, and there's nobody's necessarily going to read it. So lately my projects have really been coming out of the journal, and I'm not sure which one. I'm working on quite a few at once all of a sudden, so I'm not sure even which ones are going to take off, but it feels like such a great place to explore because there isn't that pressure, that self-inflicted pressure. And so I think for me that's really freeing.
Yeah, and I'm gonna tee something up and see if you guys have any pushback, because again, I'm very, very broad generalizations, but we are ultimately talking about. I don't find them, as a writer myself, I don't find any dichotomy, but for people that are either maybe aspiring or blocked or trying to get a handle on what we're talking about, we're at once talking about finding joy in the process, right? And discovering things about yourself, about your writing that you didn't know, and how that can become a habit, a very self-reinforcing habit, but also, not shirking away from the discipline and the fact that how, a topic that comes up in my 1455 interviews a lot is this notion of, how dare you as an aspiring or accomplished writer expect anyone to be moved by your words if you're not moved by them. If you're not dedicating yourself to this in a way that's commensurate to whatever your goals are, how are you expecting there to be any good results?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And at the same time, I think we beat ourselves up too much. So I think it's also important to be a little, I find that if I have too much resistance, and judgment can be that resistance too, then that also makes it hard to write. So I've gotten kinder towards myself. And there have been periods where I wasn't writing that much. And now I'm writing a lot, but I think that's attention too. It's like you want to give yourself enough kind of hand whacking that you actually write, but not too much that it becomes, I don't know, again, pressure or a chore or judgment. Because even if you're going to judge yourself, that's not very productive.
Right.
Yeah, I think, let's just swing for the big fence here, is that capitalism gives us a very skewed idea of what a good work ethic is.
Yeah.
And this is, something I sort of talk about at the beginning of my book. It's like, if you tell somebody that, oh, I've taken up watercolors or painting, or, I'm learning to play the guitar. Nobody expects you to have like a gallery exhibition or to be doing like concerts, in anytime soon. You tell somebody you're writing, right away, it's like, oh, what have you published? When are you getting published? So the whole idea of success in writing is tied to this very materialist capitalist goal of, if it's not if it's not paying for itself, it's not successful. And what constitutes hard work in this society is like, grit and determination and pain, rather than fun and pleasure and exploration and the joy of discovery. So that, I feel like, yes, your work is not going to resonate with anybody else if it doesn't resonate with you first, but that doesn't mean that you have to pour, to hunch over it, incessantly. That, there are going to be times when it's like when the work flows more easily than it does others. And there are going to be times when, like, sitting and thinking about how to tell your story is the most effective thing that you can do, rather than trying to put words on paper at that time.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think, it circles back to another word that comes up again and again, which is the notion of joy, right? And how do we break down, I think in the capitalist model you mentioned, or in the fact that I think most writers by nature are very circumspect and judge themselves first. What I take from both of your books that I find very encouraging and refreshing is it is this balance of not just reminding people that they have to write. It's reminding people that through that process of finding oneself and finding one's patterns, the joy will derive from that. So it doesn't necessarily, and I don't want to speak for either of you, but I don't think either of you are saying if you write every day, you will find joy, so much as if you're able to find the joy in the process, that becomes its own self-fulfilling kind of reward. And things like fame and fortune, which are perhaps unattainable anyway, tend to recede. And the important thing becomes the work itself.
Lisa, if you want to.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I do think when we stick with it, that there is a spontaneity that naturally arises. And so there might be really hard periods and painful periods, but I think it really is not possible to be writing and writing. Well, okay. I think it's very hard to be writing and not experience bliss and joy at some point. But if that's what's happening, I think it's when we just, kind of continue to go over and over something painful without ever shifting perspective, without trying to, say, okay, what can I do differently here? There were periods, especially when I was young in my journals, that I would just be really good at that. But I think that if you can just, every once in a while, throw yourself a curveball and try something different, it's not possible to not be surprised and delighted and inspired by your own writing and by not just the writing, but kind of what happens when you're writing. I think that's even more of it, is just like that experience of what happens when you write.
Yeah, to go back to the Zen metaphor that you introduced in that first question, meditation is no guarantee of enlightenment. At the same time, sustained, consistent meditation ideally makes us more receptive to the possibility of, if not enlightenment, at least insight. And I think that a consistent, sustained writing practice also ultimately makes us more receptive, opens us up to an increased possibility of insight into our stories, into insight into ourselves, and joy at what we find in those moments. Even if what we're writing about is not necessarily a joyful topic, we can still gain insight into it, and take something from that will make our lives better and bring us closer to who we are meant to be.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many quotes that bubble up in my head. I think all of us and those of you watching have probably read or heard. There's a lot of more cliches at this point, but I think one of them is along the lines of, inspiration has a funny way of striking when you're sitting down writing. The point being that you're going to have a much better chance if you're not waiting for the proverbial lightning bolt to jar you from the couch. I mean, I think as writers, we all experience those moments and they're blissful. But the reality is that if you put yourself in the position to be inspired, usually good things will follow from that. I think you just put it much more artfully than I did. But I think also, and again, just speaking for myself, having talked to a lot of writers about these issues, I think acknowledging the notion that, or the reality that fame and fortune, certainly in any endeavor, but in the creative fields and in the writing field, is always challenging and unlikely. But I think when we talk frankly about that, again, especially to maybe more aspiring writers, I find that more liberating than discouraging. The idea of, what are you writing for? And I feel that both of your books are asking that question implicitly, and in some cases explicitly. What are you writing for? If the answer is so I can be famous, I don't think either of you, and certainly myself, are discouraging that. Go for it.
Right.
But if the answer isn't because I'm finding out things about myself, I'm enjoying the process, or let's say the process isn't enjoyable, I am feeling better having tried consistently than not doing it at all. Do you guys agree that I'm not saying that it's super liberating and it's positive to look at the fact that very few of us make a lot of money, but it just begs the question of, why would you get into it in the first place? And then I think the joy also is easier to find once you're there.
Yeah, I think it is liberating, because what I found is, there definitely, being a type A and very achievement oriented, there was definitely a time where I remember with my first book, I made some little thing that looked like the New York Times bestseller list, and, put my book on it and hung it up on my wall. And, and I think when that becomes a big focus, you're not that free, like you're really in your head and in your ego. And, I think there are people who are able to write bestsellers that way. But I think when you're really writing stuff that really comes from your heart, that's a different process. And it is super liberating to say, oh yeah, like, I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to just attend to this practice I have, and attend. And that's such a gift, that then the things that start to happen with the writing, I just feel kind of in awe of it. And I guess a recent example, I didn't think I was going to share this story yet publicly, but when I was an undergrad at MIT, I was roofied. And actually, I think it was like almost every woman at that party was probably roofied. I think, but my friend was also. And I didn't know what roofing was. And it was kind of a weird experience. I didn't understand what happened. It was only a few years. And then I did eventually find out what roofing was, but I still didn't make the connection. And then I recently made that connection. I guess I'm a little slow in some ways. And I started writing just for healing about that experience. And I was super angry. And then I was, felt very much like a victim. And there was a long process in there, but I was so amazed. Like I know that people talk about forgiveness and that really is very freeing. I came to a state of gratitude for this and real compassion for the person, but gratitude, it just shocked me. Like, how could I be grateful? But I realized that it taught me that I'm not my body and that I'm so much bigger than that. And that's like a pretty amazing lesson. And so I think if we stick with the process of writing, it's one of the most incredible tools for transforming how we perceive our world, how we perceive the things that happen in our world. And yeah, it just, I guess I'm speechless now. Yeah, but it was amazing.
That's wonderful. Ron, what do you have to say?
Yeah, if you want to be famous, there are a lot of easier ways to do it than writing a book. If you want to make a lot of money, there are definitely easier ways to do it than writing a book. Going back to what Lisa just said about like making that profound self-discovery of recognizing where her self lies and her perception of the world. I think that's really key. That philosophy is ultimately just people asking, how are we to live in the world? What, who are, how do we exist in relationship to the world and to other people, and how should we conduct ourselves on, in those situations? And we have this idea that philosophy is this, grand academic endeavor, but really the question of like, well, how am I supposed to live in the world is something that we should all be asking ourselves every day. Right. And writing is a great place for us as any individual to go through and do that. And one of the things I talk about in the book is this idea. We sort of valorize and glamorize this notion of talent and literary talent. And the thing is that writing's, developing your writing voice is a matter of opportunity and to a certain extent of privilege. But it is something that fundamentally is accessible to anyone who wants to put in the time. And then it becomes a matter of like, well, how do I make room to put in the time? How can I carve out the time out of all the other obligations that society imposes on me?
Yeah, and you alluded to this earlier, Ron. I think it's worth kind of taking a little bit of a deeper dive into, vis-a-vis capitalism and how writing tends to be portrayed in movies and popular culture is the notion of the genius and the notion of either the suffering genius, which is a cliche, or the unblocked, Mozartian prodigy. But what I've always found interesting is that we seldom, maybe because it's just not sexy, we don't really talk about writing as kind of the attainment of a craft that's very similar to, say, playing a violin or becoming a basketball player. In either of those examples doesn't mean you're assured success, but you are certainly not assured success if you don't know how to play the violin or you haven't put in your 5 million free throws in practice. I think what both of your books do in a very kind and encouraging way is again affirm this notion that you should have fun. You shouldn't do it if you're not having fun, but you've got to show up. This doesn't just happen. There, with exceptions that I'm sure we could all point to, very few of them. Most of us have to struggle. I don't want to use that word in the context of this discussion. Most of us have to practice quite a bit to develop what we would call a publishable voice.
And, I would add too, like you have to show up, but you have to show up with that beginner's mind, right? Of like, I really don't know where this is going. And even that story I shared, it might become a book someday, and I want to explore and play with it. But I really don't know. And that's like kind of an interesting question too. Like, where do I want to go with this now? but I think it's show up in a certain kind of way too. Curious.
Yeah.
I don't know everything, and I'm here to discover.
Yeah, here to discover and to share what I learn along the way. But that book is as much an account of your learning process as it is of anything else. I mean, I think we've all can, as readers, we can easily tell the difference between somebody who has a fixed idea of what the market wants and is writing to it, versus somebody who is pestered's not the right word, but I can't think of the right word, but there's a question that keeps bugging them. And they're writing their way through that question. And sometimes, and that can be a fictional question. They can answer that question through fiction, as readily as they can through nonfiction, but it's something that will not stop bugging them until they work their way through it.
I think for people that aren't inclined to be writers or readers, it would be unbearably pretentious. But I think what we're getting at, and it relates to the whole notion of joy, is for so many writers, they don't know what the book is about until they've written the book. And therein lies the mystery, the potential for epiphany. But again, the joy, to be humbled, right? To be humbled by the process. Lisa, I like the way that you emphasize, again, in an encouraging way, not knowing where it's going to go. I think that's really important for younger or newer writers to understand that having a purpose and having a discipline is one thing, but as it relates to creativity, it might end up in a very different direction. Again, as writers, I think I certainly can attest to the fact that books I started out writing took a very different turn, but that was meant to happen, and it couldn't have happened if I had outlined it perfectly, or if I had forced the book in a certain direction, it wouldn't have opened up the possibilities that became obvious.
Yeah, and I think a lot of books are just practice, like you'll start a book and then it's just not as interesting as you thought or something like that. And, that's fine. It's just you're practicing. You're checking it out. It's a journey. It's like walking through the woods. I don't have to take this straight, narrow path up to the top. I can check this out and maybe come back the same way. But maybe I'll see things on the way back that I didn't see. I think the less we require from our writing, the less we demand from it in some way. I mean, not always. There are times to be demanding. When you're editing is a good time to be demanding, but when we're just still in the exploration phase, it's really important to just go along for the ride. See where the muse wants to take you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily know from one issue of the newsletter to the next what I'm going to be writing about. And even when I do, I can sit down and start writing on a topic and we'll suddenly come up with an idea that is completely askew to what I thought I was going to have to say on that subject. And those often turn out to be the most interesting columns. And then, I get enough of those and I start thinking it's okay, because of the way that this book is set up, where it was maybe 2/3 of it was from the first 2 years of the newsletter. And then the rest of it was realizing that it's oh, okay, I've been writing around this subject. Now let's kind of fill in the gaps a little bit. But even filling in those gaps, it's not like you can necessarily say it's okay, you can sort of say it's well, I'm going to wander off towards that tree in the woods, but you're going to get halfway there and you're going to notice there's a brook in your path, and so you're going to have to scoot aside until you find some rocks that you can skip over to get to the other side before you can get to the tree.
Yeah, and listen, I'd like to thank both of you midway for articulating, what we're really talking about, showing, not telling. This, how is joy discovered? How does this work? You both are really articulating that is how the joy can be found, right? By opening yourself up and freeing yourself to the possibility of being surprised and seeing where creativity leads you. And it comes back to this balance between, a purposeful path and a willingness to get lost or redirected that makes things a lot more interesting. But Lisa, well, I mentioned you get down to brass tacks. I'd love you to talk a little bit. Well, first of all, I encourage everyone to get the book, because having gone through it, there's so much in there. And I want to reiterate, both of these books, I truly believe, are invaluable for certainly aspiring or novice writers, but in some ways for veteran writers that need to be reminded of what's important or how to kind of reconnect. But talk a little bit, Lisa, you're obviously a very big fan of prompts. And I certainly agree that those are such useful mechanisms to either jumpstart creativity or to fall into these rhythms of repetition.
Yeah, but I think prompts take the pressure off. Like, I don't even have to think about what I'm going to write about. And in the Joy of Writing journal, most of the days, I ask the writer to come up with 5 or 10 things on a list and then choose one of those and apply it to the prompt question. Mm-hmm. And I did that because, like, sometimes I won't be that inspired by the first thing that comes to my mind. And so it's nice to have a few choices, I think, about what's going to be a fruitful place to go, maybe. But for me, I think a lot of time it really takes the pressure off, and there's something freeing. And actually, I'm working on maybe adding something to the book with this idea that you can write your own prompts. So it's kind of helping the reader write their own prompts and then answer them. So I started doing that for myself. I had some exercises to write your own prompts and trying that. And this morning I wrote for like 2 hours, just answering these prompts. And it was surprising. It was really fun. So, I think the thing about prompts is it can take you unexpected places. And yeah, I don't know if it's Zen exactly, but I think it is something that's sort of, again, liberating, right? And it could become a book, but it's just like a starting place. And sometimes that's the hard thing, is the starting place. One of my professors was Frank Conroy, back the year before he became the director of the Iowa Writers Workshop, when he was the director of the National Endowment for Arts and Literature. And Frank talked about a professor of his who used to just take the first 3 pages of whatever you handed in and tear them off and throw them away, and then would read whatever you handed in. But I think there's truth to that sometimes that beginning is so hard, and there, and sometimes painful. And I think with prompts, like, you skip some of that painful part of just trying to find where you want to go, because you're not so tied to where you're thinking you want to go. You're just kind of letting the prompt lead you, and it can lead you to something faster, if that makes sense. Sometimes.
I was going to say a preemptive strike against self-blockage.
Yeah, I think it is.
Ron, any thoughts about either specifically about prompts or, again, getting back to this notion of, I think in your book you quote, and I love it, that writing is comprised of a series of small victories.
Yeah. I think that prompts, whether they, certainly outside prompts, take the pressure off us having to come up with a story idea, or, that initial moment. But ultimately, because everything is connected, kind of lead us to where we're meant to be anyway. And I think that over time, you do sort of get, again, talking about getting into that state of receptivity, or openness, that eventually you're able to see more and more things as prompts, and that some days the prompts will work and some days they won't. If writing is a series of small victories, it's also a series of small defeats. And to quote another great saying, fall down 7 times, get up 8. You just have to keep at it. When you have a defeat, you have to realize that it's like, okay, that's as far as my writing could take me today. Let's see how far it takes me tomorrow.
Sure. So, Ron, I'm going to ask you to expand on this very provocative notion of, quote, destroy your safe and happy lives, how that relates to writing and life.
Yeah, so that line comes from a Mekon song about, God, like probably about 25 years, 25, 30. I don't even want to think about how old it is because, that will just make me feel old.
Yeah.
But for me, and the line continues, destroy your safe and happy lives before it is too late. And for me, in a creative sense, and tied to some of the things that I've already talked about in terms of like, the expectations that society has on us in terms of like, go do this job, conform in these ways and make sure you're fulfilling these notions of success. Writing or any creative endeavor offers absolutely no guarantee, no stability, no promise other than that, you go there and you put the work in. And it's not necessarily going to be like happy in our standard notion of happy, and it's definitely not going to be safe, but it is ultimately going to teach you things about yourself and about the world that you aren't going to learn, following the standard route.
Yeah. And Lisa, I think that tees up to pass the mic to you. Again, I think something that really, to me, is reinforced repeatedly in both of these books. And again, I think this is a very liberating notion, is that there's no one size fits all. There's no, do these 6 things and you will be a writer. And I think, again, getting back to how things are marketed today, we have, I think in America especially, we have an inclination, we have a propensity to want that. Like, let me hack it. What's the shortcut? But this idea that it is different for everyone. There's certain patterns, right? And your book, I think, epitomizes this, Lisa. There are patterns that you can follow or prompts, but be liberated by the fact that what works for one person might not work for you, as long as you try to find what does work for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I find myself saying a lot to my students that I'm going to tell you kind of what works a lot of the time, but you've got to listen inside, because you may hear, no, don't do that, do this. And you've got to listen inside, because it really does vary. And it varies too from time to time. There are times when prompts are really working for me, and other times I just want to be working on the book I'm working on and I don't need a prompt, and forget about those. So, you got to pay attention to what you're hearing inwards.
Yeah, I mean, to me, when famous writers kind of shrug their shoulders and go, "I have no idea how I do it," again, that heard the wrong way, that might sound so pretentious, but there's a real humility to what works on a given day, even for successful or super successful authors, probably varies. Lisa, I'm going to throw a quote at you, and I think you both will have some thoughts about this. But I think that there's so many quotes I could have pulled. In fact, before we came on the air, I was showing like the dog ears, which is always the sign of like a well-read book. But there were so many great quotes and nuggets. But you have a quote in your book toward the end, Lisa, where you say, if you find yourself asking, who am I to be so bold? Ask instead, who am I to withhold my creative gifts?
Yeah, and I think that's probably not that original now that I'm hearing it, but it is, I think, a profound truth that when we're in the ego, we're so much about, maybe I should hold back, be humble. Like that's a false humility, really. And we really owe it to ourselves and to our fellow human beings and the earth to really play big and be bold and take risks on the page and take emotional risks and explore things that don't feel so good right away, but try to look, get it on the page and then see, okay, and what are some other ways I could look at this? I think it's all a kind of a bold experiment when it comes to writing. But I think that's some of where our best writing often comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think about that too in terms of, who am I to like, to try this? Again, going back to what I said earlier about the way that privilege often frames the trajectory of successful writers, or people who, they don't necessarily fall into book deals because they put in the work. They did the book. But certain people, by virtue of their privilege, are able to be in the right spot at the right time, or are able to get to the right spot at the right time with considerably less difficulty than other people. And it's not impossible, because we all hear stories about people who beat the odds and who put in incredible amounts of work and managed to get themselves into the right program or whatever. But it is exceedingly difficult within that system to have that kind of success. It is not difficult in that way to actually to have the kind of aesthetic or literary success, of the actual content of the prose. It's difficult in the sense that it's like you've got to spend a lot of time doing it. And then but that is separate from the question of, is anybody ever going to see this? And for me, it's like, I think there's that part where you have to recognize that it's like, I have to do this in order to to get a better understanding of who I am, and divorce that from the notion of what I am going to do with this in the world, with the world outside once it's done.
Yeah. And you both explore in the books, but you've also both mentioned it tonight, the notion of kind of the crippling and counterproductive self-doubt and insecurity. I'd love to talk a little bit about I think an under-discussed notion of this whole picture, which is the critical importance of having a nurturing community for both understanding and encouragement. Because I think we frame writing as necessarily a solitary endeavor, but I think the writers that remain aloof or are unable or unwilling to reach out to their communities make it more lonely than it needs to be. And I feel like in 2022, for all the things we can and perhaps should say about social media and the pressures and so forth, the distractions, there is an opportunity to engage that didn't previously exist. And I think that's also kind of a very liberating sign.
Yeah. Well, let me start off by talking a little bit about 2020 and this notion that a lot of us had when we had the privilege to not be working, to not have to go to the office or wherever, and to shelter in place. When we had that privilege and that opportunity, many of us said to ourselves, "Oh, I'm going to have all this time. I'm going to get some creative work done. It'll be great." And some of us did, and some of us didn't, and that's okay. And for those of us who didn't, and I count myself, what I was able to, granted, I was able to get, some very cool things done, and I got the book out and everything, but this is the tip of the iceberg of the dreams and aspirations that I had at the beginning of that process, and more will come later, but there were plenty of days when I was just like, oh, screw this, the world is just bearing down on me too much. I'm just going to watch another afternoon of TV rather than try to deal with the writing, and that's okay. Yeah, it's a process, and like I say, small defeats as well as small victories. And if you don't get the writing done one day, you keep at it the next. And one of the things that keeps you at it the next is your community. And one of the reasons you get, those of us who are lucky enough to get into an MFA program, one of the reasons you do that is because you're basically buying time and space and a community of people who will support you in your creative endeavors. For those of us who don't have the opportunity to pay, to buy our way into that system, we kind of have to luck out, or not luck out, I should say, but cultivate our own communities. Sometimes sometimes it's of other writers, and sometimes it's just of like a spouse or a partner who understands that, you know, you have to like go hide in the corner for an hour with your with your keyboard or your notepad. You know, friends who understand that it's like you're not always available to like come out and play at a moment's notice. Yeah, I make it sound so kid-like, but it's, yeah. And as you said, social media is great for helping us find other people outside our immediate vicinity who understand why what we're doing matters and can offer encouragement. You know, there are so many people in our lives who will say like, oh, you know, you'll never break into publishing. Oh, you know, good luck getting an agent, or, you know, if you sell it, it's never going to go anywhere. You know, we get enough of that.
Right.
And, you know, so we need to have those relationships with people who will, you know, they aren't going to blow smoke up, you know. Okay, let's find a nicer, more genteel way of putting that. They aren't going to sugarcoat it for us.
Yeah.
But they're going to say, you know, this is hard, but it's worth it.
Yeah. Lisa, what are your thoughts on community and the role that plays?
Yeah, certainly for me, community has been critical, and I see it with the people I work with as well. You know, there's so many pieces to it, right? There's the accountability, and just seeing other people writing kind of inspires you, hopefully, or even setting time to write, whether it's virtually and you're both writing, or in a group on a Zoom group, or getting together and being outdoors and writing by the river or something. I find that really supportive, because sometimes for me, not as much now, but there have been times where, I don't know, it's hard to do it alone. And it really helps somehow to just be in a space, whether it's virtual or in person, writing at the same time. And even now, actually, I'll say that I had this group, we just ended, but Get Your Writing Done. And all we would do was a few breathing exercises, a little movement, set a one-word intention each that we sort of contributed to the space, and then wrote, and then some gratitude at the end. But it is, it's really powerful to be writing among other people, because it can be so solitary. And I think especially when you're exploring hard stuff, sometimes it's easier not to go there, and it gives you courage just to be around others. So I think there's something even energetically, but then there's also that, you know, as Ron said, you know, the support that you get when people are cheering you on and helping you to stick in there when things get hard, when you get the rejections, or when your writing's not really, you're not finding where it's going to go, you're feeling really stuck, then it's helpful to have people you can talk to about that, and you're not just carrying it alone. And sort of, I think we can get kind of in our heads in this place that just kind of goes on an endless loop. That's not helpful. You know, friends can get you out of that, community can get you out of that. And then also, I think community supports each other, right? And, oh, wow, I think my agent would be interested in that. You know, those are music to people's ears, right? So there's so many ways we can support each other as community. And then even just getting feedback too, having people read and give honest feedback. And I think good community gives feedback that's real. It's not just like, oh, this is great, but that's real, and also really helps us to make it better. So there's just so many things I think that community can do. And then, you know, if we talk about the commercial side, we wouldn't be anywhere without each other, right? That we're all supporting each other to get our work out there. And that's a huge piece. So I think in all phases and all aspects, it's really helpful to have community. And I know there's some people who will just write on their own, and that's great. It works for them. But I think most of us need some level of community a lot of the time.
Yeah, I'm realizing as you're talking that it's like, the two sort of like writer communities that I hang out the most with on social media are romance writers and sort of like religious social justice voices. And the reason that I hang out with in those two groups, one is because both of them tell like really amazing, inspiring stories about the world and the possibilities of the way we could live. But the other reason too is that those are two communities of writers that are incredibly supportive of one another. And science fiction is another literary community that does this as well. That the best people in those fields realize that it is not a zero-sum game. That that being a fan of one writer does not preclude you from reading anybody else's books. And so these these romance writers, these science fiction writers, these progressive religious authors are all boosting, letting everybody climb on their shoulders, or giving each other's hands up the mountain, recognizing that the rising tide lifts all the boats. And for an aspiring writer, that I think is a powerful thing to internalize, that you are not in competition with anybody. It often feels like we're in competition for like those slots on the publisher's calendar, but you're not. It's once you like sort of set yourself out or apart from that material result and just concentrate on telling the best story you can, I think your whole perspective on how you approach the craft changes.
Well, time flies when you're talking writing and joy. We're almost out of time. I want to thank both of you for sharing your insights. I want to thank both of you for writing these books. I will make sure in the comments on the Virginia Festival of the Book Facebook page, as well as the 1455 Facebook page, I'll put bios and links for how to connect with both of these writers. We will put links up and I will share my screen in a second for independent bookstores you can support. We encourage you to buy your books from those independent bookstores. We want to thank everyone who came out to watch tonight. Please consider buying these featured books from your local independent bookseller using the link provided at vabook.org. You can also check out other events in the 2022 Virginia Festival of the Book at vabook.org. And like I said, I am going to put a link up for how to buy these books, and we're going to put a link up for a survey if you care to fill that out and let us know what you thought of this. Ron, Lisa, could have talked a lot longer, but we fit a lot in an hour. My closing salvo will be, if you're not already convinced, pick up these books and you'll be amazed at how joyful you'll feel and how productive you're ready to be. Again, I thank both of you, and I hope we are able to talk again sometime soon.
That would be lovely. Thank you.
Thank you both. And before we leave, I'm just going to share my screen if I can. Well, maybe it's not going to let me. Huh. Well, we were able to go live, so that tech snafu was avoided. So let's see. Oh, here we go.
There we go.
Okay. So again, thank you all for being here. This event was inspired by Anthology. And that I'm going to share my other, because I think the other one is the one I wanted. All right, I will put the links to the bookstore and the survey in the Facebook comments. Everyone have a great night, and we will see you all again soon. Thanks so much to Virginia Festival of the Book for doing all this amazing work on our behalf. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much.